Hello, everyone. This is David Paquette from Zerto, an HP Enterprise company, and thank you for coming to the webinar today. We're just going to wait another 30 seconds or a minute for some additional attendees to join. So if you'll please be patient, I will get started very soon. Okay, I see that we have a fair amount of attendees, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. Thank you for joining today. Today's topic is IT resolutions, DR planning for 2022. So I'd first like to start off by wishing you a belated Happy New Year. The beginning of the year is always a good time to start thinking about disaster recovery planning, as well as other planning for the upcoming year. So that's what I want to talk about today. My name is David Paquette. I am a product marketing manager at Zerto, a Hewlett-Packard Enterprise company, and I'm going to go over the agenda here real quickly. So today we're going to be talking about disaster risk assessment, critical asset identification, business impact analysis, some DR planning best practices, how to choose the right DR solution, and getting the ability to recover in minutes to a point seconds before a disaster happens. And just before I get into this, I'd like to talk a little bit about these first three: the disaster risk assessment, critical asset identification, and business impact analysis, about how they're all sort of tightly woven together. And you'll see that as we go through. These are not necessarily processes that you'll do independently, but they were all related to each other. And we'll see that as we go through some of the different presentation slides. So let's just start off by talking about disaster risk assessment. What this really is just trying to figure out which disasters your organization is most at risk from. So you can see here in this in these photographs, there are a number of different types of disasters, from natural disasters to man-made disasters. They can range from very large regional disasters that can happen, like hurricanes or earthquakes, to more localized disasters like fires. They can be man-made disasters like power outages, or cyber attacks. Those are very prevalent lately. We'll talk a little bit more about those later. One of the biggest things that determines what the risks are to your particular organization is geography, like where you're physically located in the world, because natural disasters are different depending on where your geography is. So for example, if you're located along the coast, you're going to have to worry more about events like hurricanes. If you're located in the mountains, you may have to worry about events like blizzards. So your geography is really going to be a factor in determining what types of disasters that you're going to be facing. Geography can also matter in terms of man-made disasters. For example, if your organization has sites that are located close to areas of the world that are prone to armed conflicts, or have crumbling infrastructure that could affect things like power availability or network availability, those could be issues for you that you have to address with disaster recovery planning. So first, understanding what the relevant disasters are for your particular area is very important in deciding what the risk is of those disasters happening to you. Another thing that you need to be on the lookout for, no matter where you are, in every geography and pretty much in every industry, is different types of cyber attacks. And one of the most prevalent right now is ransomware. It is so prevalent, in fact, that it's not really a matter of when you will be attacked, but if. Or, I'm sorry, it's a matter, I said that the opposite way that I should have. It's a matter of when you will be attacked, not if you will be attacked. So some of you out there have probably already dealt with ransomware attacks in the past. These are just some predictions from some analysts for what we could be facing as near as 2031, with the cost of ransomware soaring to $265 billion per year, and the frequency of attacks, going to 2 attacks per second. And that is a something that we all need to be aware of. I mean, right now, the cost of ransomware attacks, I believe, for 2021 was somewhere around $20 billion. So really, if you think about it, there's already like an economy, growing just around ransomware itself and the ransomware business. We even see ransomware as a service. Now, ransomware is not the only type of cyber attack to be on the lookout for. There's also cyber theft, identity theft, dedicated denial of service attacks, different types of spyware. All of these are things that you need to worry about. But ransomware is really the one that needs to be treated most as a disaster because of the disruption it can cause to your organization in terms of taking your systems offline and causing downtime and data loss. So just to summarize real quickly, identify the different types of risks that your organization is going to be susceptible to based on the industry that you're in and your locale, and definitely include cyber attacks in that list of types of disasters that you're going to be facing. Now, the next thing after identifying the risks that you're going to be facing are identifying the critical assets that are in your organization. Now, these critical assets are going to be different depending on what industry you're in and the type of organization that you're running, but here are a few examples. You're going to have certain critical applications that you need, and to go along with that, critical data that's used to operate those applications. You may have point of sales systems that are vital to your organization to keep your revenue flowing. You could also have various types of online services, which may include e-commerce, but they may just be customer services that are subscribed to that you need to have up and running. You may have communication systems that are vital to your organization. And if your organization or your business model is more around customer experience, you may have certain systems that are related to the customer experience, such as those online services or other types of systems that are vital to making sure the customer does not become dissatisfied with the service they're receiving. So all of those are just some examples of the types of systems that will be critical to running your business. Only you will really know, depending on your industry and the type of business that you run, what those critical systems are. Now, once you've identified those critical systems, you also need to look at dependencies for those critical systems. So for example, you may have a critical application that you need to make sure your business is up and running. Well, that critical application is probably not just running on its own. It probably has other either applications that it depends on. It may have other systems that it depends on, and even at a lower level, it's going to have virtualization, virtual machines, for example, or containers, hypervisors, storage systems, networking, maybe security systems that it needs for authentication. So when you're looking at these critical systems, you really need to look at the dependencies as to what's the total number of systems that go into allowing that one critical system or critical application to run, and make sure all of those are protected as well, so that you can get that critical application back online as quickly as possible after a disaster happens. When you're looking at these dependencies and the critical assets, you also might want to look at tiering, creating priority tiers for which are the most critical, which are less critical, and maybe which are the least critical. It's just some examples here as well. For the most critical, it may be direct customer services. It may be your point of sale systems to continue doing business. It could be, if you're manufacturing, it could be your manufacturing systems. It could be a number of things depending on what industry you're in. These are just examples. You may have I have 3 tiers listed here. You may have 2 tiers. You may have 5 tiers. It just depends on what you think you need in terms of defining what criticality those systems are. And the main purpose of creating these priority tiers and determining the criticality is to determine maybe in which order you bring these systems back online. So most critical, you're going to want to bring back online first. The less critical, maybe in a second wave of bringing these systems back online, and then maybe at tier 3, tier 4, tier 5 are the ones that can wait a little longer, are less of a priority. and you can bring those back online at a later time if necessary. But identifying which are the most critical is really going to help you sort of hone in your disaster recovery planning on what should be the focus of your disaster recovery response. So after you've identified your critical assets, then you also want to look at do a business impact analysis. And this is really going to be related both to what those critical assets are and sort of the disaster risk assessment in terms of what could happen to those critical assets in whatever the disaster may be. And some of the typical types of cost impacts to the business from disasters are going to be things like downtime, data loss, reputation loss, possibly being out of compliance because of the disaster, and maybe some recovery costs. You can see there, based on that IDC report, that downtime is typically one of the larger costs. So let's go into that a little bit further. So the cost of downtime, again, this is going to be dependent on industry, but one of the biggest costs of downtime, for example, retailers or those who do a lot of business transactions, are just going to be lost sales or lost revenue with the inability to do business while that downtime is occurring. But it could also be lost productivity. So if your systems are down, you may have idle workers, you may have idle machinery, all of your systems may be idle because they can't get access to the systems and the data that they need. Or it could be a loss of services, as I talked about earlier. If you're primarily providing some sort of online service or other type of service to your customers, they could be without that service. And a lot of times that's just an inconvenience for the customers. For example, if you can't get your streaming movies at home because of an outage, that's an inconvenience. But say you're a hospital or a 911 call center, if your systems are down and you don't have access to those, and customers or users of those systems, patients at a hospital, do not have access to the care that they need because the systems are down, then they're actually then at risk from that downtime. So the severity is going to depend just on the industry as well as the type of downtime that's occurring because of any particular disaster. And all of that needs to be taken into account for your particular organization, your industry, and try to calculate the costs based on what it is that may be out in a particular disaster. Data loss can have a different set of costs. When you look at data loss, there are a couple different types of loss. Data can be stolen, for example, in a cyber attack. With ransomware, data is encrypted, but it can also be stolen at the same time. Or if it's a physical or natural disaster, you may have data that's just lost because your physical infrastructure is lost. And the cost of that lost data is a lot of times going to depend on the types of data that you have. This kind of goes back to the critical asset analysis or critical asset identification, determining what data is more critical than others. That data may be intellectual property. It may be transactional data related to e-commerce, or for example, if you are an online retailer and you're taking a lot of orders online, and something happens, a disaster happens, and you lose all of that data, which includes all of that order information, that could be lost business to you, even without downtime. And on the other side, if data is being stolen, it could be sensitive personal data that is for your customers or even your employees that's now leaked out. And depending on what industry in, that data could also be related to national security. So there are a lot of different types of data out there with different criticalities depending on your industry and what your organization does. So it's important to look at each of those data sets to determine what would happen if that data was lost and what the cost of that data loss would be. So just looking at some of the additional costs, I talked about these a little bit earlier. Reputation loss, if you are particularly experiencing downtime, there could be a loss of customer loyalty because of the downtime incurred. Reputation, though, is a little bit tricky because customers are going to be more understanding of certain types of events, such as natural disasters. Obviously, there's not much you can do about certain natural disasters happening and services being impacted by those. However, they're going to be less forgiving if that was the result of, say, a cyber attack of some kind that probably could have been prevented by you being more ready for such an event to happen. And downtime could result in sort of missing out on new business if customers are trying to access your services during the downtime and they are unable to. They may just move on to the next vendor or the next retailer who can provide them with those services. So there are a lot of situations there where the brand can be damaged and the reputation of the organization can be damaged because of downtime or even data loss. There are also implications for compliance. Having a disaster and losing data, having data stolen, or just having data not available anymore can result in being out of compliance with regulations, in which case that could result in fines or other types of legal actions, which could be very costly to your business. And finally, there could be additional recovery costs, particularly if you're unprepared for a disaster to happen and you are experiencing downtime and data loss and you have to pay for third-party expertise to come in to help you to recover that data or to get your services back online. That type of third-party consultancy, particularly in a high-demand area such as disaster recovery, can be very expensive. So those are all just various types of costs that you need to be aware of in terms of the business impact of various types of disasters that can befall you. So let's go talk a little bit about DR planning best practices. So having done all of the risk assessment analysis for critical asset identification and the business impact analysis, you will want to start the DR planning process. So the first thing you want to do is choose a recovery site, a site to which you can send your data and applications, everything that you need to recover your organization or your business. And you have a couple different options here. First, you can build your own or use an existing site that you may have. That requires that you have infrastructure in place to do that, suitable infrastructure somewhere. It requires that you have staffing to operate that facility, and it requires that you have the networking available to actually send the data to that location. And if you are wanting to fail over your applications and services to that location, then you then have the ability to bring those services online and access them. So that is more of a capital expense in terms of getting that set up and making sure it's suitable for your DR needs. If you do not have a site or you do not desire to build your own, there are a lot of options available for hosted sites or cloud services, right? There are lots of public cloud options. And with those hosted or cloud options, you have the ability to either do a self-service model where you are just renting the infrastructure as a service, and then you are doing the rest of it yourself in terms of setting up all of the DR software, setting up all the storage, etc., that you are making sure you have all the necessary storage and compute at that site that you need, and setting up the cost structure for that. You can also do it from a disaster recovery as a service model where the service level may be fully managed or maybe partially managed to where you're managing some of it and your service provider is doing the other part of it, or they could be doing it fully for you. So there are definitely options there for if you want to have a service provider provide any of that disaster recovery service for you. I know that at Zerto, we work with a lot of managed service providers to provide these types of services to customers, and it's a very attractive option if you don't have a site available already or you don't have a suitable site. So let's talk a little bit more about what a suitable site looks like. So again, back to the slide of geography matters. It matters again when you're choosing your disaster recovery site. One of the main things that you want to think about is having the ability to avoid a disaster that might be regional, right? There may be a hosted data center that you could put your disaster recovery site in, a couple miles away, but what's going to happen if there's some sort of regional disaster like a hurricane or an earthquake or something that affects both sites? You may not be very well protected in that case. So being able to go a decent geographical distance away from your primary production site, and this is where the cloud can come into play and be a very attractive option, is that there are typically multiple data centers within some of the larger public clouds that you can choose from in order to put your data. There's really typically no difference in cost in moving it around between those different regions. And then what that also provides is within those cloud providers or hosted providers, they have their own disaster recovery built in. So if one of their sites fails, they can automatically switch over to another site, often called availability sites. What this also allows you to do is proactively fail over and recover to that site to avoid an incoming disaster. For example, if you can see that a hurricane is approaching and you're in the hurricane path, then you could proactively move all of your services off to that DR site ahead of the disruption of the hurricane hitting, so you can make sure that your services are uninterrupted. And we have a lot of our own customers who do proactive failovers in those cases. As if you can see the disaster are coming with enough time, typically a couple days, then it's pretty easy to execute those plans to move all of your services and then move them back when you know it's safe again. All right, what else? Identifying your recovery point objectives and your recovery time objectives. So once you've established what your recovery site is going to be, you need to determine what is possible in terms of how much data you can afford to lose and how much or how long you can afford to be down. And those are going to sort of determine your recovery point objective and your recovery time objective. Now, you may already have existing service level agreements in place. If you have those in place, those are also going to determine what your recovery point objective and your recovery time objective are, because they need to be within the confines of the service level agreements. But it's also going to be determined by what your actual DR solution that you have in place can achieve. For example, if you may have an SLA that says that you need to, if your services go offline, they need to be back up within a certain number of hours or maybe even minutes. You need to make sure that the disaster recovery solution that you have in place can achieve that. Or maybe the disaster recovery solution that you have in place can achieve a lot more than that, in which case you can significantly lower your recovery point objective or your recovery time objective, depending on the ability of the solution to achieve recovery of reducing data loss and reducing downtime. So somewhere in between what you can afford to lose or afford to be down and what your DR solution can actually achieve is where you want to be. And of course, no one wants to lose any data or be down for any amount of time, but that's not realistic. So you're going to have to instead look at the DR solution, which is going to give you the best possible outcome. And as we talked about earlier in tiering your different critical assets for criticality, you can have multiple RPOs and RTOs set for those different tiers. So you may have one set of or one recovery point objective and recovery time objective for your most critical assets, and then have a different recovery point objective and recovery time objective for the less critical assets. And what that's going to be is really going to be determined strictly by you alone with what your organization is required to do, what it can afford to do, and what the DR solutions that you have in place can actually achieve for you. Next thing you want to do is actually document all of your disaster recovery plans into what we call runbooks, which is just a set of steps that you would go through. You want to make sure you detail each step that's necessary to execute your disaster recovery plan. Make sure it's all documented and detailed. And a lot of times it's helpful to create a checklist. So as you're actually going through the disaster recovery plan in a response scenario, you can just check off those different steps as they're being executed, so you know exactly where you stand. One of the things you want to do as well is document anticipated complications or contingencies. So, for example, a disaster may impact your ability to communicate with some of your other team members. It may impact your networking connections. It may impact your actual physical facilities and so on. It may impact the ability of different respondents to actually perform the tasks available. So all of those types of contingencies that you can think of should be documented, and try to have workarounds for those within the plan. And probably the final thing is just to make sure that you have a record of all the support numbers for all of the different vendors of your IT systems that are involved in the systems that you're trying to bring back online. And those can be critical in if you encounter any issues while you're trying to bring these systems back online. It's getting support as quickly as possible. So make sure all those numbers are easily available to those people who are responding to the disaster and executing the DR plan. Which brings me to the next thing, which is actually identifying those people, what we might call an incident response team. So all of the people who are responsible for responding to any particular disaster that's occurring, whether it's a cyber attack or whether it's a natural disaster that's occurring, making sure that they understand what steps are necessary. And again, as I said, with contingencies, you want to make sure that you have some backups for those responders built into the plans as well. In case they're unavailable for whatever reason, have some backups designated, and then plan as well as you can for communication between any of those response team members so that they can easily communicate with whatever needs to be done at the time of the disaster occurring, and they can execute their plans accordingly. If they can't communicate, that's also something that needs to be planned for, but try to have some sort of communication plan in place so that they do have the ability to communicate wherever possible. And then, of course, make sure that they're fully trained on all of the disaster recovery plans that you've already detailed out, documented, et cetera, so that they know exactly what needs to be done. And a lot of that training is going to come from the next thing, which is DR testing. You want to be able to test your disaster recovery plans, ideally multiple times a year. You want to be able to test individual applications. So just bringing back, certain critical applications, bring those back online, testing to make sure that each individual application can be brought back online as quickly as possible. But you also want to go through entire disaster scenarios. So what would actually occur, or what would you actually need to do if, for example, a hurricane or an earthquake or something disabled an entire site? All of the steps that would be necessary to fail over that entire site, or at least all of the critical assets that are needed to a recovery site. And in those cases, again, you should be testing as realistically as possible, trying to incorporate as many of those sort of contingencies that we talked about into those recovery plans. So maybe simulate communication failure, network failures, other types of contingencies that you may think of that may affect your ability to execute the DR plans. And the benefits of testing are many. First, you have training for new staff who are just come on and are not already very familiar with the DR plans. You have the ability to refresh the training and the knowledge for the existing staff who may have already been trained at a previous time, run through tests previously. One of the main benefits of testing is identifying, gaps or flaws in the DR plans. So as you're executing the DR plans in a test scenario, you can identify where maybe the plans aren't fully detailed, they're confusing, they don't really cover all of the steps that are necessary, and also you probably will need to update those DR plans for different system changes that are happening. IT systems are not static, and they're living sort of organisms that are always changing. We're always installing new software updates, new different applications, etc. All of those need to be incorporated into the DR plans. So DR testing is a great time to update all the plans with anything that has changed from the last time that you did a DR test or the last time that you went through the DR plans. All right. So let's talk about choosing the right DR solution for you. First thing I want to talk about is how legacy backup solutions are inadequate for disaster recovery. They just are. They may have been okay for disaster recovery 10, 15 years, 20 years ago, but today's digital transformation world demands a higher levels of disaster recovery that these backup solutions cannot provide. So these solutions that are providing periodic backups or snapshot-based backups really do not have the recovery point objectives that are necessary. They're not SLA oriented enough in terms of providing the right RPOs or RTOs that are required. Today's modern businesses, offsite tape reliance, which is used for a lot of backup solutions, is good for long-term retention strategies. For certain aspects, but it's not really, it's no longer reliable for many of the compliance regulations or the regulations that you need to comply to in terms of recovery times and being able to actually bring that data back in a reasonable amount of time for compliance even. And a lot of times these solutions just lack scale. They are okay if you're dealing with a small or medium-sized business, but as you scale up to the enterprise, they really sort of fall down in their ability to facilitate site recoveries efficiently. And typically you cannot do any sort of proactive failover. We talked about proactively failing over to avoid a disaster that's heading your way. And you simply can't do that with most backup solutions. So what is required in today's modern world? So if you look at the right there, that diagram is basically just showing some of the complexity that we see in modern data centers, right? You have different types of platform as a service that's being incorporated, software as a service, private clouds, public clouds, even within on-premises data centers, and you have hybrid cloud scenarios as well as a combination of virtualization and containerized applications. You may be employing various types of managed service providers into the overall IT strategy. So it's much more complex than it used to be. And that's another reason why those legacy backup solutions really don't fit very well anymore, particularly for disaster recovery. So the things that you really need to focus on are having continuous availability no matter where the apps live. So whether they're on a software as a service or platform as a service, infrastructure as a service, anywhere that they live, or whether they're in a hybrid private cloud or public cloud scenario, you need to be able to protect those solutions. You need to be able to recover within minutes at scale. So recovery within hours is no longer acceptable. You really need to be able to recover in a matter of minutes, and you need to have down to the second recovery. In other words, recover 2 seconds before disaster happened so that there's minimal data loss. And those all of those recovery options need to be application centric. In other words, provide the consistency of data that applications need to be able to come back up quickly and to be able to do that across disparate platforms. And the other thing that you want to focus on is just simplicity and ease of use in the solution. A solution that is built to support all of these different types of platforms, but that can be executed simply when the time comes, so that all of the services and data can be brought back online as quickly as possible. And hopefully this slide sort of speaks for itself, but you need to look at the return on the investment of the solution that you're picking. And a lot of that comes down to how many of the costs of a disaster can that solution mitigate. So obviously on the left there, if you have a solution that is not really set up for good disaster recovery and you're not very well prepared for a disaster to happen, the cost of downtime, data loss, and the reputation loss can be very high. So by reducing the downtime and the data loss, you're also going to reduce the data or the reputation loss, and those costs can be very minimal compared to what can happen if you're unprepared with the wrong solution. And that cost savings just in one disaster can easily pay for the recovery solution, regardless of where your assets might be or what particular solution it is, but making sure that the solution provides you with the lowest RPO and RTO available, so that the downtime and data loss are minimized. All right, so let's talk a little bit about what Zerto does for disaster recovery. So I've talked to you about disaster recovery planning. I want to talk to you a little bit about how we approach disaster recovery and disaster recovery planning at Zerto. So we're considered a market leader in disaster recovery. This is just one of the many quotes that we have from one of our satisfied customers. Just leave that up there for a second so you can read it. But we are a leader in disaster recovery because of our focus on reducing downtime and data loss, having the best RPOs and RTOs in the industry. So we do more than disaster recovery, but that's our bread and butter. That's what our company was founded on. We really protect, recover, and move data and applications across on-premises, hybrid, and multi-cloud environments. That's our core tenets of what we do as a company. And our focuses in terms of recovery are ransomware recovery, disaster recovery, and having the ability to move your workloads between multiple clouds and multiple platforms. And all of that is based on a platform of continuous data protection. I want to talk to you a little bit more about what continuous data protection means. Continuous data protection is a combination of three elements, really. The first one is near synchronous replication, the ability to replicate in near real time to from on-premises or from other platforms to other on-premises infrastructures or to cloud infrastructures on whatever storage you choose. And it's hardware and storage agnostic. It means that your assets, your critical assets, and even your least critical assets can be protected with always-on protection. That's one aspect of it. Another is our recovery journal. Our recovery journal creates recovery checkpoints every 5 seconds. So it allows you to recover within minutes to just seconds before an attack. So whenever, or well, by an attack, I mean some sort of disaster that occurs. So with that, we're able to provide the fastest recovery point objectives and recovery time objectives on the market at scale. And it also gives us our ability to neutralize ransomware threats. So application-centric recovery is the third part of continuous data protection that is probably maybe the most important. That is our ability to maintain application consistent data across multiple virtual machines or containers within what we call a virtual protection group. So we maintain the right order of fidelity across, any of those various virtual machines or containers, so that your critical applications are always kept in a consistent state and are recovered in a consistent state at any of those recovery points that we've identified in our journal. So you can always bring your critical applications back online as quickly as possible with the most recent data. We don't have staggered backup windows. Other solutions, are unable to maintain consistency across different virtual machines or containers. They are taking a snapshot or a backup of one VM at one time and another VM at a different time, and that breaks the application consistent data across those different virtual machines. With Zerto, you don't have to worry about that. We group them together logically per application, or however you want to group them for entire sites, for example, so that you always have data consistency within those recovery points. So now that I've talked about our continuous data protection and why that's so important for bringing your data back online as quickly as possible, we also have our actually, I almost forgot about this slide. So this is just illustrating some of our larger customers and the RPOs that they're able to achieve with a different number of virtual machines. I apologize for that, but you have United Airlines with 4,000 PMs with an 8-second recovery point objective. Jack Henry with 2,000 virtual machines, 6-second recovery point objective, and you have a couple other unnamed but very large organizations and customers of Zerto that are also achieving, RPOs below 10 seconds on over 1,000 virtual machines. But the way that we're doing that is not just because of the continuous data protection that I just talked about, but it's also because of our simplicity at scale and the proven reliability that we provide with our solution that has become a gold standard of performance in the industry. All right, so having the data within seconds of the disaster is important, but getting your systems back online is equally as important. And with this illustration, we're just showing the simple steps that it takes to easily bring back all of your systems from an entire site. Just a few clicks and you're able to fail over multiple virtual machines, hundreds or even thousands of virtual machines, entire sites worth of data and applications. Or if you choose to do so, just individual applications. However, you have logically divided up your assets within those virtual protection groups to make it easier for you to bring your systems back online. And that again is going back to identifying your critical assets and executing your recovery plans based on what you've identified as those critical assets and what needs to be recovered because of business impact. The other important thing you need to know about Zerto solutions is the ability to use multiple different platforms. So whether it's going from on-premises to on-premises or on-premises to the cloud, whether it's protecting virtual machines or protecting containers, and whether you want to use Zerto for moving your workloads around between these different platforms, or strictly for disaster recovery, or even protecting your workloads that are already running within the cloud. Zerto has all those scenarios covered. It's a seamless mobility in disaster recovery across all of those supported platforms. You can see the different virtualization platforms and clouds listed there at the bottom. All of those are supported by Zerto. So we really give you a holistic view of platform support and the ability to perform disaster recovery, backup, and migration across those platforms. And finally, I talked about simplicity, being able to do all quickly and easily. That comes down to orchestration, automation, and our built-in analytics. So I haven't talked a lot yet about the our non-disruptive testing, that is sort of built into our failover. You can perform a test failover into an isolated environment. That's one of our most important features in terms of DR planning, and so you can execute your disaster recovery plans at any time in a test environment. It's completely isolated and doesn't disrupt your production environment. So that allows you to test often and allows you to test in isolation without disrupting any of your systems. And the other thing that's built into that is disaster recovery reporting that is built in for compliance. So you can easily generate reports out of our non-disruptive testing mechanisms for either your compliance needs or just for your own benefit to know that you're ready to respond to a disaster when it happens. The other parts of this are that we have a full API set that allows you to integrate with any of your existing tech stack, and that makes it also easy to scale up Zerto to thousands of VMs and petabytes of data so that we can support easily with the same simplicity disaster recovery and migrations across an enterprise and make it just as simple as protecting tens or hundreds of virtual machines. So I think that just about wraps up what I want to talk about in terms of Zerto capabilities for today, but there is a lot more that we can do. I would urge you to look at some of these different assets that I've listed here: our disaster recovery guide, our DR testing essentials guide. We have a nice report that was done by IDC on our behalf with the State of Data Protection and Disaster Recovery Readiness in 2021. Has a lot of really great useful information in it. And also our cyber attack survival kit, which talks a lot more about ransomware and ransomware recovery. So if you want to learn more about all the various solutions that Zerto provides for all the different platforms that we have available, I urge you to look at those, as well as going to Zerto.com to learn more about some of our other assets there and our online labs, and being able to get a live demo scheduled for you. So with that, I think I'm going to move into addressing some questions. So let me pull up the questions here and see what we've got. All right, give me 1 second. Will there be a presentation handout? That's a great question. There will be a record. This session is being recorded, so the recording will be available within a matter of days, I believe. Can you please provide some examples of anticipated contingencies? I think I already did that, but some of the examples of anticipated contingencies would be, network outages, communication outages, just basically the inability or difficulties in being able to respond to the DR plans as they are. If you, for example, are trying to execute the DR plans, but you cannot communicate between sites, that could be an issue in trying to execute the DR plans as effectively as you could. So being able to have steps built into your DR plan as to what to do if those communication failures occur are important. That way, people on both sides of the equation will know what steps to take, even if they can't communicate with their peers between sites. That's probably the best example of one of those contingencies. Another contingency might just be, maybe not all of the people who are supposed to respond to the disaster are able to respond because of the nature of the disaster. So you don't have all of the respondents available. So the respondents who are available, may have to execute additional tasks based on that unavailability. If the main data center goes down, can Zerto initiate failover from alternate site? Yes, it can be initiated from an alternate site. Basically, from wherever you can have our Zerto virtual manager running, you can initiate failover So that can be running either at your primary site or at a recovery site. Do you have Office 365 to cloud solution? Yeah, we actually do have a solution that protects a number of different software as a service offerings, such as Office 365. And you can find out more about that on our website. We have a number of different software solutions that are available with that solution. Is there a demo version of Zerto available? Yes, you can request a trial version of Zerto. You can do that on our website. There's a process for requesting a trial of Zerto there. Let's see. Can we set automated failover or does failover need to be initiated manually? Typically, failover would be initiated manually. I've been working with failover solutions for about 20 years, and I can tell you that there may be cases where automatic failover is desired, but I would say in 99% of the cases, automated failover is actually not desired, simply because the ways that the types of monitoring that you have to do to determine when a disaster or failure scenario has happened and when a failover should be initiated can give a lot of false positives. And a lot of times automated failover will fail over at an inappropriate time because of those false positives. So it is typically better to have some sort of manual intervention required before actually committing to a failover, rather than just having automatic failover occur. And that being said, I believe the answer to that is that with Zerto, you can set up automated failover using our APIs and so on. It's not something that's built into our GUI. It would have to be manually initiated. And I think that is almost always going to be the right way to do it. Could I touch a bit about the test failover? Yeah, the test failover really is sort of for the non-disruptive testing that I was talking about. The test failover can also be used in different actual disaster scenarios. For example, if you got a ransomware attack, you may want to do a test failover into an isolated environment so that you can identify the ransomware and make sure that the ransomware has been removed from your recovery set, because sometimes ransomware can sit on a system for days, weeks, even months prior to an attack occurring, prior to the data actually being encrypted, and therefore the malware of the ransomware may still exist within the data sets that you're recovering. So doing a test failover into an isolated environment can allow you to find out where the malware is, so that when you want to recover it back into a production environment, you can easily remove that and make sure that you are malware free. Let's see. Sorry, just going through. There's a lot of great questions in here, guys. Just going through a couple of these questions to see. Is it possible to replicate to a second data center in a cloud at the same time? Yes, that is a great question, and the answer is yes. It is possible to do what you'd call a one-to-many scenario, where you are replicating, protecting your workloads to one site, such as a secondary on-premises site, and also to the cloud simultaneously. You can also do the same thing to a local journal for local recovery, and then also to the cloud. And then you can also do what we call long-term retention to another storage tier within the cloud. Should be used more for backup long-term retention process possibilities. What? Does Zerto solution manage IBM AIX servers? No, we do not currently support AIX servers. What is the possibility of ransomware with Zerto system? So I think that what you're asking there is, what is the possibility of Zerto itself being attacked or encrypted with ransomware? And the answer to that is that it is possible for Zerto, some of the different Zerto components to be affected by a ransomware attack. That is where we actually have some best practices in place for ransomware readiness. One of the things that can help protect you against the actual Zerto, for example, your Zerto virtual manager being encrypted, is having going across multiple platforms, for example, because a lot of ransomware attacks target multiple platforms. We're also moving towards a different format for a virtual appliance, which will offer additional protections. But ultimately, what you can do with Zerto against ransomware, which will give you the best protection, is immutable data copies, which you can do with our long-term retention. So you can move a long-term retention copy of the journal into another tier of storage and make that copy immutable, so that if a ransomware attack happened, that would be sort of like, if all else failed, you'd always be able to recover that copy of the data because it is immutable and unaffected by ransomware. But there are a number of things that you can do to prevent different Zerto components from being affected by ransomware. One of those, probably the main one, is just having it spread across multiple platforms, then some additional security measures. Let me do a time check real quick. Yeah, we're right at the hour, so I'm going to go ahead and wrap it up there. Thank you for all the questions, and again, I encourage you to go out to our website for more information, and thank you for attending the webinar today. I really enjoyed presenting to you and hope to hear from you soon.